Hello there. Glad that you can be with me today. I'm Steve Cole, the pastor of the First Methodist Church in Oswego, Kansas, as well as the West Mineral Methodist Church in West Mineral, Kansas. Today we're going to be having the sermon for November 13th, 2022, and a short little passage out of the Gospel of Luke where Jesus is talking about the temple. In Luke 21, verses 5 and 6. Some were speaking about the temple and how it was adorned, and beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God. And he said, "As for these things you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." May God add a blessing to the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of His Word. A few years ago, Susan and I went on a trip to Santa Fe, New Mexico. The reason? We just wanted to go someplace we'd never been before, and Santa Fe seemed like an interesting place, and we could get there in a relatively short period of time. So we went. And it was a very interesting thing. We went to go see the sights and sample the food. And I will say, the food was really good. Of course, if you like Mexican-style food, Santa Fe is a really good place to go because they have lots of it. And they also have a lot of art. There's lots of different artists are there, and there's lots of things to see for people that love art or history. There's a lot of museums and things to see that have to do with history as well. And one of the attractions to visit is some of the old churches in the area. They're very ornate, have some beautiful artwork, wood carvings. It's fantastic. And one of them had a spiral wooden staircase that went up to the balcony. Very, very elaborate. And lots of people were coming to this church, one to see that spiral staircase, the stained glass windows, some of the other wood carvings. It was a stone building. Quite a thing to see. But also, as you left the building, on your way out, they had you go through a gift shop to possibly buy some little miniature things of the church, or something that looked like pictures of some of those ornate carvings and things like that. And of course, a place to make donations to help upkeep the church. It was an interesting place to see. And that's all fine, well, and good. But it makes me wonder, why was that building built in the first place? Was it built to be a tourist attraction? Or was it built as a place to worship God and to pray? And it seems like the main emphasis right now, anyway, would be as a tourist attraction. Now, I have no idea. On Sunday mornings, there might be a nice little group of people that come and worship there. But I didn't see a whole lot of worshiping going on when I was there that day. Of course, it wasn't a Sunday, so who knows? Back in 2003, and I remember 2003 because tornado. That's the year that my daughter graduated from high school. There was a tornado that hit Franklin, Kansas, a small town just outside of Arma, north of Pittsburgh, about 7 miles north of Pittsburgh. And the town had a little community center there where people had gatherings like weddings, wedding receptions, family reunions, anniversary celebrations, things like that. And I even did a wedding there once upon a time. But the community center was destroyed by the tornado that hit there in 2003. Well, the people applied for a grant to rebuild the community center, and they got it. And they even asked for donations from people to help rebuild the community center. And they did. They got it rebuilt. And they put in some, not only is it being used again for weddings and family reunions, anniversaries, things like that, family gatherings. It was, again, a community center, but they also added some little displays of some of the history of the area, especially the coal mining history, and they had some of those displays. But it got to the point where there got to be more and more history displays, and weren't quite so many other community activities taking place. And community activities were kind of messy. You had to, somebody had to coordinate this, somebody had to clean before and after, and it got to be kind of a hassle. And so instead of it being a community center, they just added more memorabilia and turned it into a museum. Well, good, bad, or otherwise. But the thing was, it was built to be a community center. It became a museum. I wonder if that's similar to some of our churches sometimes. Oh well, that's another issue altogether. But in our passage today, people were looking at the temple and how it was adorned, beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God. And it was. The temple was magnificent. It had gold, and in the morning, when the sun shone on it, it would be just a magnificent thing to see. It was ornate. The temple was an amazing thing to see. But Jesus tells them it would eventually be torn down. And he was right. 40 years later, the temple would no longer exist. But just because the temple was destroyed, it didn't stop people from still worshiping God. There's a song in our hymnal called "We Are the Church." The words say, "I am the church, you are the church, we are the church together, all who follow Jesus all around the world, yes, we're the church together. The church is not a building, the church is not a steeple, the church is not a resting place, the church is a people." I remember one place that they had to make a decision. A major ice storm came and did a lot of damage to their building, and they had to make a decision: do we rebuild, take the insurance money and bring it back, or do we take the money and build a new building? Well, they voted, and overwhelmingly voted to build a new building. That was the congregation. The congregation voted. I think the vote, in fact, was all in favor except for one abstention. Nobody voted against it. But it wasn't the people in the congregation that voiced an opinion. It was people in the community. People that were not part of the church, were not members of the church, didn't attend services at all. But they said, "Oh, but it's a wonderful landmark. It's a historical building. How could you possibly tear it down? We used to go to scout meetings there. My parents were married there. Or my grandfather's funeral was there. Oh, we can't lose it. It's such a wonderful place." That was people outside the church that were saying that. The people that didn't really have a say in it at all. But why was the building built in the first place? A place to worship God. And that's the interesting thing. The people were making these comments about we used to go there for all these different activities. Not one person said, "Well, it's such a wonderful place to worship God and to pray." They didn't say that. But the building does have a purpose. Our church buildings do have a purpose. It's a place for people to worship God and to pray. And that's why we have our buildings. It's a place for fellowship, where we can come together as fellow believers. That's the purpose of the building. We worship God, not the building. I've noticed over the years that if a congregation is having trouble paying their expenses, so the utilities and whatever, they might, and they ask for money, a little bit will come in. So you need to give us a little extra money or we need to do some kind of fundraising to pay the expenses. And instead of trying to figure out paying more and finding ways to do that, they say, well, let's find a way to reduce our expenses so that we can afford to pay it. But if there's a need for, say, a new roof, a new air conditioning heating system, something to do with the building, a lot of times if they ask for that, the money comes in. We want to maintain the building. Oftentimes we refer to the building as the church. Well, the church is at such and such address. Well, that's where the church meets, because the people are the church. The building is the place where the church comes to worship and pray. No matter what, all our buildings will no longer be here. They will eventually, might be 40, 50, 100 years from now, but one day they will no longer exist. It might be several years. I've seen churches that when they could no longer function as a place for, there weren't enough people coming anymore, they closed the church, we might say. The building's still there, but it becomes something like maybe someone's home or a business or whatever. It's no longer used for a place of worship. And I've seen that happen a few times. The reality is, the church is wherever a group of people come together to worship and pray. The building is just a place where everybody can come together. And there's been, not only are there our traditional church buildings that we use all the time, sometimes a church meets in a community building or in people's homes. There's lots of people that have home churches. Some places they use a movie theater, that there's no movies being shown on Sunday morning. They have old church services on Sunday morning in the movie theater. Or maybe a hotel or motel that has meeting rooms. Not a whole lot of need for those to be used on Sunday mornings, and so they rent them out. And sometimes it's even at a school. They use the school gymnasium or classrooms to hold their church services. And that even goes back to the days when we had the old one-room schoolhouses, right? A lot of times they would be used for school during the week, and on Sundays, that was the church. Okay, multi-use, multi-function there. And maybe even, possibly, a funeral home. Church of the Resurrection in Kansas City, that's how they started. It's a huge, magnificent building now with fantastic stained glass windows, but has thousands of people come there. But they started meeting in a funeral home with a small group of people, because there aren't really that many funerals that are held on Sunday mornings. So kind of an interesting place to go. And they even have a downtown facility now that was once a bar. Robert Schuller, who eventually had what was called the Crystal Cathedral, he started out at a drive-in movie theater. That's where he got his beginning, and he got his group of people, and then they eventually built the Crystal Cathedral, but he started out in a drive-in movie theater. Paul writes to several letters to churches, some of them to Corinth, and Ephesus, Colossae, and others. None of those church buildings exist today. Some of those churches maybe even met in homes. They didn't actually have a church building. They met in people's homes. And he does write a letter to the Romans, but the letter to the Romans wasn't to a group that met at where the Vatican is, or in St. Peter's Cathedral. It was a group of people that met somewhere in Rome, and possibly in homes. The thing is, as long as there are people that gather together for worship and pray, that's the church. That's the church. And it's not just one particular denomination or one particular group of people, but it's all over the world. The church is the believers in Jesus Christ all over the world that worship God. And of course it kind of applies to us as well as individuals. There's a couple passages in the Bible that refer to our bodies as being the temple of God. Do you not know that your body is the temple of God? Interesting way of looking at it. After all, Jesus lives in us. His presence is with us. Wasn't that what the temple in the Holy of Holies is said to be, where the presence of God came? Our body is the temple of God. In 2 Corinthians 5:1, it says, "For we know that if this earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens." Our body is kind of likened to a tent. And then it's also likened to a building. That if this tent is destroyed, we have a building from God. How about that? In the same way, none of us is going to live forever. At least not physically. Eventually we'll no longer be here. We don't like to think about that, but it will happen one day. We will go to be with the Lord. Our body will no longer be used, but our soul and our spirit will go to be with the Lord. And we will no longer have this earthly tent to live in. The church building come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes, different architectures. Some have very elaborate stained glass windows, and others are just your basic metal or wooden building, nothing really of any great and wonder. In Africa, there are places where they meet in what we might consider like a pole barn with a thatched roof and just poles on the side holding it up. Hey, that's where they meet. That's where the people come together to worship and pray. The thought is, does God really care what our building looks like? That's more of a human thing. That's something that we want. Now, people might say, well, it helps them feel closer to God. Okay, that's fine. But does God really care what the building looks like? Or how magnanimous the stained glass windows are? God looks at the heart. He looks at what's inside of us. And whether we're worshiping in spirit and in truth. It might be said true about how we dress. Like you say, our body is the temple of God, right? And how we adorn this body. I might be getting a little personal here. I don't know. But I remember when I was growing up, you would wear your Sunday best, right? Men would come and wear a suit and tie, and women wore a nice, fancy dress, right? And sometimes even a hat. And that's what you wore to church. And I can remember the first time I wore blue jeans to church. I went to church one time. Didn't have any dress pants to wear at that particular moment in time. And I walked in the door of this church, and we were visiting. It wasn't our home church. And guess what? A lot of the other people at that church were wearing blue jeans too. I fit right in. No, we don't really get dressed up for church like we used to. But does that really matter? Because God looks at the heart, not what we're wearing. Okay. Some people have noticed over the years, I don't wear a robe. Lots of pastors do. I don't. I really don't think that that we should be dressed in any different way than the rest of the congregation. We're all part of God's family. We're all, as we say, if we believe in the priesthood of the believer, we're all priests before God in that sense. So why should I wear something that differentiates me from the rest of the congregation? So pretty well wear what everyone else is wearing. Now, I don't have a problem with that. And it's not that I don't have a robe. I just choose not to wear it. But, some do, and that's fine if that's what they want to do. But God looks at the heart, not what we're wearing. And God looks at the heart and doesn't care about what our building necessarily looks like. It's not that we shouldn't keep the building up and make sure that the building is cared for. But is that the most important thing? What did Jesus tell us is the greatest commandment? To love God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and all your strength, right? Nothing said about a building or what we should be wearing. Yeah. And Jesus told the woman at the well, the hour is coming, is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. I hope that this was a blessing, and I'm glad that you could be with me. Now may we go knowing that God goes with us to guide us, lead us, and help us today and every day. Amen.